Perhaps it's time to review our year of living through a global pandemic, and in another day, it would have been called a plague. This may be a little uncomfortable for us, but let's do it together, and we'll come out on the other side with some good news. I will use my own experience as a guide to review this year, and yours may be a bit different, but I suspect will be similar. And we're going to peel back the layers of this experience as if we would be peeling an onion. And I've called this a promiscuous response to grief. So, our experience begins last February or maybe March 2020, the year of the great insight, 2020 insight, right? Probably we began by dismissing the virus. It can't be that bad. And few people remembered or had experienced the Spanish flu of 1918 and the West Nile virus or Ebola or SARS, the swine flu. Those were far away in another part of the world. And this was far away in China. So that first outer layer of this onion is one of denial or dismissal, followed quickly by distraction. For with the war in quarantine, I wondered, well, this is going to be a temporary problem. Maybe I need another loaf of bread. What can I use to substitute if I run out of something or other? Do we have enough provisions? What kinds of shortages are there going to be? You can't hardly predict that, especially when you don't really believe it's going to be a big deal. And just how can we make do for the short time that it's going to take to get through this? Now, this layer is uncomfortable and anxiety producing a little bit, but because we want to deny the impact or the potential, we didn't even think about that. We couldn't get our heads around that. So we just had this thin layer of denial and dismissal, and maybe a bit of creeping anxiety. So my plans for the weekend got canceled in March, and well, bummer. And my plans for the next week are now uncertain. Oh, bummer. The virus is an inconvenience. We lost some family activities. We lost social time. We lost our plans. But the next layer is when the fear begins to set in. Some people panic, buying sprees in the stores, fear of running out of what we thought was so important. I wanted a supply of wine, and the stores were closed. And I wanted yeast to bake some bread. Because bread was comfort food, not because I usually and routinely bake bread. But there was no yeast in 4 grocery stores I went to in Philadelphia. But especially there was fear of how much we did not know. How in the world is this thing spreading so fast? Are we all at risk? How can we stay safe? Does the virus stick to an apple or banana? Does it live on cans or SWAT light switches? So much was unknown. So gone was the sense of certainty and predictability and stability of our days. We'd lost the rhythm that we didn't even know we had. The calendar is now in chaos because now it's empty. I am reminded of an illustrator, Charlie Brown, Charles Schultz, who once said, I have a new philosophy. I'm only going to dread one day at a time. The next layer after that is more intense fear, and we begin to feel panic. When will I see my grandkids again? How am I going to go to a doctor? Which appointments do I cancel as not necessary, and which ones do I risk getting deathly ill? And do we even dare run errands? How many risks do we take? What is a big risk? And what's a small one? And then we begin hearing the numbers, number of deaths, and the dismally small number of protective wear for our hospital workers. And the church ladies start sewing masks by the dozens. We begin to panic. What happens if we contact the virus? If we contract it? And will there be hospital beds available? Will doctors stay healthy enough to treat the patients? Will we have to be put on a ventilator? Will we recover? Should I plan on not surviving this epidemic? What last minute things do I have to do to prepare to die? Where's my will? And is it current? And then when the vaccines are over, finally now, so we move to another layer of feelings as our feelings turn to relief, but still intense anxiety. Will they work? Did they cut corners to make them? Will there be enough for us? How long will I have to wait? Who do I trust? Politicians or health professionals? CDC? The governor? My doctor? We already know that few medical health professionals in our lives specialized in vaccines or viruses. So now we finally get to the core of our onion, the core of the issue that we all have to examine before we can move on to the other side. And that is the grief. We cannot move into a healing space without acknowledging all of the losses we have gone through and are still going through. People have died. Families are in mourning. Some became very ill, and some may never recover. Friends, family, friends of friends, co-workers, loss of the expectation of good health. We lost our faith in an effective government. We lost our idealism, our expectation of privileged status. The virus does not recognize status or your bank account or the color of your skin, though for some it is worse. We were losing this struggle for quite a while, and we lost our innocence. We lost the confidence that we were in charge of our lives, that we could decide when, where to move or shop. We lost the ability to plan for our future because we didn't know if we had one or how long it would be. We lost our freedom, our independence. We lost the ability to say goodbye to those who died. And yet our grieving was stifled and could not be expressed well because everyone was quarantined and we feared spreading it or contracting it. Some of us lost jobs. We lost a recovering economy. We lost the ability to hug our friends, to even see our friends or family. We lost our access to weekly worship services in a sanctuary with our church family. We lost so much in 2020. It is right to grieve for all we have lost. And we grieve that we have all been changed. There is grieving when we realize that life after a global pandemic will never resemble the life as it was before the pandemic. We have been changed. Church will never be confined to Sunday morning in the sanctuary again. The definitions of what is church have changed. It is right for us to feel sad that so much has been lost and so much has changed. Grief is part of what we must allow ourselves to feel. And as we move through it, we will slowly begin to heal. So where is the good news in the midst of grief that is appropriate and sadness that is inevitable? What is the gospel when life turns upside down and there's pain and suffering all around? So I got to thinking, when was my very worst time in my life, the time in which I grieved the most? the time when I asked God where God was when I went through that time. And the time was 1986 when I separated from my husband. When he moved out, I was grieving. My son had left at the same time, not because he took sides, but because he wanted to leave the small town we lived in. My daughter, who was heading for college, stayed with me, although she had thought I was to blame for this separation. My family was now split apart. It is not what I had planned for my life. Privately, my heart was breaking. Several months passed, few people knew that he had moved out and my son had moved out. And I remained uneasy about the possibility that a divorce was probably unavoidable. I was a pastor of a floundering church that was beginning to re energize. They did not know what I was experiencing except for the pastor parish committee. They did know. One Saturday, to my great dismay, my husband had gone, before the separation, had gone to a yard sale that was held by people who knew people in my church, and he had purchased items in preparation for setting up his own apartment. So, this lack of discretion meant our secret heartache was now no longer secret. He was moving out. I had no choice but to tell my congregation my marriage was eroding faster than I thought. If I was to stay ahead of the gossip, I had less than 24 hours. So the next morning in worship service, I blocked out my personal life. I made it through the end. And before the benediction, I said, I hope you will stay after the services if you remember this church. And people looked a little surprised, but most people stayed. So I walked to the front of the church, stayed away from the pulpit with its power symbol, walked down to the front of the church, and I began. When you hired me, you hired a married woman. But I must tell you today that to my great disappointment, my husband and I are separating, and I am not hopeful for a reconciliation. This will most likely mean we will seek a divorce in the near future. Perhaps not, but I don't want to mislead you. I know you had not planned on having a divorced pastor. And I realized I really hadn't thought this through or what I was going to say. They just needed to know that. So I was going on pure instinct. And that's when it hit me of what I had to say next. So therefore, I am willing to offer my resignation. I had no more words. I felt completely depleted. No words, empty of expectations, just empty. I had loved this church. I had loved this ministry. I had longed to be a pastor, and I had blown it. And now it was probably all gone, along with all of the other losses. My son, my marriage, my hopes and dreams for my life, my expectations, my imperfect private self was hanging out there for everyone to see. There was nothing more to do but name what it was and deal with the consequences, whatever they would be. Like the prodigal son, I was in the far country, and I didn't know if I could go back home. I had smashed against reality. The board chairman, who was a very gruff man, he walked up front and he said, All right, you've heard what she said. Go home and think about it, and we'll call a meeting and talk about it another time. And he didn't announce a meeting. I was a little surprised. Nobody moved. He turned to me and he said, We're so sorry. And the way he said it, you knew that was his benediction. Meeting over, we're done. And his wife stood up and walked up to me and gave me a hug with tears. The other two couples that were on the pastor parish committee rose and came to the front down the aisle, and they hugged me though the men had never hugged me before. And they said privately, I know what it's like. It happened in our family too. It's okay. You'll get through it. And then another person came forward to give me a hug. And my eyes were blurred with tears of relief and sadness that this was beyond me. It was out in the open. I was grieving. They knew it. And I was anxious and uncertain about what this meant for being their pastor. But mostly I was emotionally exhausted. And I accepted the extended hands and the hugs, the touches as a few more people approached me. And I could barely take in what was being whispered to me. And I only half listened. You're one of us now. I'm so sorry. I'm here for you. It's okay. We love you. And after a while, I realized they were all saying the same thing. It's like it had been rehearsed. It was like I was in a play and they were repeating the lines, same sentiment over and over. And I looked up and there were two aisles in this church sanctuary. And everybody had gone to the edge of the pew and was lined up in the aisle. And they were all waiting their turn to come up to me and whisper and give me a hug. They were saying, you're welcome here. Never had I failed so utterly, and never had I been so unconditionally loved. Never had I publicly presented my private hurt and pain, the intense grief and feeling as if I were a horrible failure in my life, and never had I felt such complete acceptance. It was pure grace, undeserved privilege, abundant forgiveness, compassion seeping into the gaping hole in my battered soul and filled me with the impossible, the unexpected experience of unconditional acceptance. This was love. This was sacred space. I looked at these aisles of people, incredible power of a Christian church community of people who, when confronted with suffering, are not afraid to offer healing where there's only brokenness. This unplanned and unexpected response was the very embodiment of God's grace. No dogma, no doctrine, no rules, no judgment, only wildly promiscuous love. This was the care, gentleness, and love of a church that believes in the possibility of a resurrection, always. In any situation of grief where we die on the inside, where parts of our lives are dying, we must move towards the resurrection. And to do that, we have to give up the idea that God is going to come in and take care of everything. And say instead, we will take care of you. And we cannot just say, God loves you, this disembodied spirit up there. We have to say, we love you. The church has, throughout most of its history, talked about divinity coming down into flesh rather than the real incarnational truth that is promiscuous, that says the flesh shows us divine. When we are in pain, we naturally cry out. We need to cry out. Why? Every child and every infant knows to send a distress signal, because when you do, others may well come to our assistance. It's the secret of the 12-step program. We cannot get sober and clean until we have others walking by our side. It's a community of broken people who can help us restore ourselves to healing. Not perfect people, not pure people, not people with answers, simply broken people reaching out to one another. Therein is the hope and the healing possibilities. And as we share the inner core of our grief to heal, Our response to another's grief must always be promiscuous. This idea comes from theologian Laurel Schneider, who says that God's love for us is promiscuous. She writes, promiscuous incarnation suggests excess and indiscrimination of divine love. Promiscuous incarnation implies a God outside of human control and outside of religious rules, but not outside of human life and experience, and not outside of human dangers and hungers and desires, and not ever far away from our ecstasy or our grief. She says, God becomes flesh for a purpose, and that purpose is radical, compassionate, promiscuous love of the world to such an extent that suffering in any person, in any body, is a wound in God's flesh. And so we love promiscuously because that is what we need to heal the wounds in one another and ourselves. And we move through our grief together in community because others' suffering is our suffering. Their grief is our own. Think about how Jesus modeled this with his disciples in Matthew 26. Jesus and his followers had gone into Jerusalem together. And after the dangerous, although triumphant entry, Jesus tries to prepare his followers for the grief they will feel in a few days. And then as a group, they all go to Bethany for a dinner as a group to Simon the leper's house, where a woman washes his feet with expensive perfume. And there he reminds them again of the coming grief and says, you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she's prepared me for burial. And the next day they go to the upper room to celebrate another meal together. And they know grief and fear and sadness and anxiety, and Jesus keeps them together as a community. And they reach out for one another, first in Bethany, then in Jerusalem, then the Passover meal. And after Jesus' crucifixion and the disturbing news told by the women who visited the tomb, disciples continued to gather and do the same thing. Cleopas sought out his friend, and they walked to Emmaus. Companionship would help them heal, and they're chatting away, and they're going to go visit friends and invite a stranger to join them. A promiscuous love always is about hospitality. Our United Methodist friends say open arms, open doors, and open hearts. Hospitality and inclusion. In the early days of the early church in Acts 1, they met together and they soon were called the body of Christ. They lived so the flesh could show the divine rather than the other way around. And they shared things in common, and they took care of the widows and the orphans, and they delegated responsibilities so everything could be done. In our deepest grief, in our deepest wounding of whatever kind it may be, God's radical, compassionate love can reach into that very spot and heal it. I know I have felt it. It is promiscuous because it comes from surprising sources, because it is so abundant and freely available. It is these fleshly bodies that show us the divine. I felt it with the spontaneous expressions of promiscuous caring during my deepest hour of grief. And it broke through, and I felt the presence of God. People simply moving heart to heart. And in doing that, we connected soul to soul. It was consecrated space. It was sacred space. And I felt the presence of God, of broken people throwing caution to the wind and listening to the Spirit, showing me what promiscuous love looks like. To love promiscuously is to choose the sacred path. Whatever burden we have, Whatever pain we carry, there is love to be shared. And all it takes is reaching out for one another, reaching out promiscuously, abundantly, consistently, reaching out because when we do, we let the smile of God touch through each one of us. Amen. May it be so.